Well, let's discuss the results of this poll now. We're joined in studio by Dr. Iva Sarakinski and Professor Alex van den Heever, economist at the Wits School of Governance. Thank you so much for coming in. Lovely to have the both of you with us. So you must have looked at the results of this poll. It's a fairly interesting one. First of all, let's look at the methodology here. And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Sarakinski. First of all, they were asked, respondents were asked on a scale of 1 to 10 to 1, where 10 means totally in favor, 0 means totally against. How would you rate the following leaders? A fairly open-ended question?
Yeah. And it doesn't signify that much. And the problem with this kind of market research opinion survey stuff is that, as we've seen with Brexit, as we've seen with the election in America, as we've seen with the local government elections in America, when you're measuring perceptions, things go wrong in reality when people actually have a formal opportunity to express a view. So this is market research stuff. It's hot air really in terms of taking it too seriously. It's political amusement as opposed to political science.
Prof. van den Heever, what's your feeling about the methodology used in a survey like this? Is it important to get a sense of what South Africans think of their leaders?
I think it is important to continuously take a temperature, and I think that I agree with all the comments made by Iva. I think that the science behind it can be quite weak in some instances, depending on the sample size, and there's very little known about the background of the people that are being sampled. But you can see changes in trends. It will pick up some movements. Whether or not it will be accurate and predictive is another matter.
So let's get stuck in and look at some of the information that came out of the survey. First of all, we look at the overall rating of adult South Africans. And here we looked at various months, November 2014 to November 2016. So it's been done over a couple of years. And of course, we're looking at Jacob Zuma's popularity here, Dr. Sarakinski. Jacob Zuma has dropped from 5.7 to 5.4, 5.1. He drops to 4.0, and then he gains a little, goes up to 4.8, drops back down to 4.0 by November 2016. I mean, what does that trajectory tell us about how the populace is feeling?
It doesn't tell us very much, to be honest. And the reason for this is that in terms of the sampling, how was it done? Telephones? Who's got telephones? If it was a sample weighted in terms of a rural sample, perhaps you'd see something very different. So Hillary Clinton's advisors got a huge shock when the results came out. And we're seeing exactly the same kind of challenge in doing this kind of research here. It's very problematic, and it tries to give us a false sense of security in terms of measuring scientifically in a laboratory context the popularity of leaders, whereas I think we really need to take these kinds of surveys with a pinch of salt.
Prof, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, I think that surveys can be indicative of trends, movements, changes. Again, the extent to which they can predict particular results is obviously in question. If we have to look at the US elections, it's quite clear that sampling shows you that it's at a very high level. It did indicate movements. If you were looking at a prediction of the popular vote, the results were consistent with that. But the question is, can it actually pick up greater nuances? It does pick up movements, it does pick up trends, but can it predict a winner or a loser? I would say it depends very much on the size of the sample and the stratification and the detail.
Well, would you say that, just looking at these figures that we have in front of us, that you can trace a kind of trajectory of what was happening on the political front at various times at which the survey was taken, or is the populace simply immune to what is going on in terms of its popularity towards Jacob Zuma?
I think that and this is where I'd say, again, I think that this does indicate a trend. I think it would be hard looking at the news events and what's been happening over the past 2 to 3 years to say that the popularity of Jacob Zuma would not be impacted at this point. If we had to look at the Ipsos polls of the local government elections, again, how predictive they were of specific results is in question, but they definitely indicated something materially different from the previous local government election, and it was correct. It wasn't necessarily correct in the absolute detail, but it was correct in detecting a significant trend and movement. And I would say that these movements are showing that there is a drop in popularity of Jacob Zuma.
Yeah, but there's a problem with that. The trends are so broad and the boundaries of what's in and what's out is so wide that it's almost impossible not at some way or in somehow to show that you got it right. The trick is to get it right within a small percentage of error. And when it comes to these kinds of things, these surveys, they really, you wouldn't want to bet your political career following these things too closely.
Fair enough. Let's look at Jacob Zuma's rating by race. And this is an interesting one. Black South Africans, 4.6 in November 2016. Again, at that date, 2.1 as white South Africans favour him, 1.6 coloureds, and 2.7 Indian. I mean, does that tell us anything at all about what the population by race is feeling about the president and why that should be the case?
I think it does indicate that, again, consistent with the electoral surveys, quite aside from the results, it does demonstrate that there's variations that you would expect to see. So it's not as if the information, that there's absolutely no information conveyed by the surveys. He would be less popular. You'd expect him to be less popular amongst whites, coloureds and Indians. In the case of the black population, there will be a significant support within certain socioeconomic groups, rural areas, for instance. Again, I would agree that depending on how the sampling is done and what type of socioeconomic group is indirectly being picked up by the survey can affect the results. But this isn't something that's sort of, this is not a structure of results that is unexpected.
Let's jump ahead, in fact, to the Jacob Zuma rating by community sizes, because the rural issue is something that you mentioned at the beginning of this interview, Ivor. And that is interesting because the metro is sitting at 3.5, the city 3.8, large town 4.3, a small town at 3.4, a village 4.5, and rural 4.9. So a significantly larger support base in the rural areas for Jacob Zuma.
But there's nothing here that we didn't already know, and there's nothing here that we couldn't have deduced from election results. And election results are the only polls that count. And there you've got reliable data in terms of sample size and people making and expressing a clear view, unambiguous. And one could easily extrapolate and do this from the election results. So for me, this is a whole brouhaha to put on paper what we already know.
Let's look at the comparative aspects of this poll for a moment. We looked at, or Ipsos looked at Jacob Zuma and Praveen Gordhan ratings, working people versus people not working. Now, those working full time, there was a 3.7% or point vote for Jacob Zuma. That was different with Praveen Gordhan. He had a 5.4 rating there. In fact, let's just have a look at that graphic that's on screen right now. And that, of course, tells us the different groups Ipsos looked at, those working part-time, those not working, and those unemployed. And clearly, there's a marked difference between the way working people, those working part-time, or those who are unemployed perceive the two. Would you like to comment on that, Alex?
Yeah, I think firstly on, let's say, the type of information that's being conveyed by surveys, it's an attempt to produce information between major surveys where you have substantial samples like elections. So one wants to know if something's changing, what's an opinion in society, and the question is how much information can be conveyed from the necessary smaller sample. I think that the difference that you pick up here is interesting. It does actually show that there is, even if you can't be sure on the absolute number, what it shows is that there is a difference. But here is a difference in perception across all socioeconomic groups, which is interesting.
Well, what do you pick up from that graph?
Well, I'm a bit concerned. I don't see a motivation for comparing Jacob Zuma to Praveen Gordhan. Are they trying to say good guy, bad guy, and force the respondents to choose sides in terms of who they perceive to be better at governance and who's worse at governance? So just the comparator, I think, is forcing people to make decisions on what their approvals are, which is artificial.
Is it not based on the series of political events in which the two were perceived to go up against each other?
Yes, and in other words, all they're capturing is an already existing sentiment which we know. There's nothing new in this.
Let's look at how other leaders were rated. We went a little bit deeper here. In the next slide, you will see a number of leaders were looked at. The following leaders: Jacob Zuma, Pravin Gordhan, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Julius Malema, Mmusi Maimane, and interestingly, Cyril Ramaphosa as well. So there were two possible presidential contenders within this group. And if we have a look at what these figures are like, I mean, they sit fairly close together. Cyril Ramaphosa and Pravin Gordhan, for example, and you have others there who are further apart. Well, what are you reading from that, Ivor?
I don't know what to make of this. Mm-hmm. The fact that you've made a selection of leaders where you're categorizing people and then you're giving them zero-sum options in terms of choose A or B or C, the fact that they're in relation to each other can distort the actual opinions that anyone has. So Cyril Ramaphosa in relation to Julius Malema is going to sway people one way or another. And you're not actually testing what people really think about a particular leader. The opinion is a relation between two leaders, not the opinion of a particular leader. And that's why an election is the most reliable test of this, because you choose a political party, and at local level you choose a particular member of the ward committee for your council. And in that sense, you've got a reliable database on what people think about a personality. This is all relational. And the relations can swing the outcome in various ways and distort it in various ways.
Alex, are you reading it that way?
Firstly, I don't agree that in South Africa an election can be an absolute result on this type of comparison, because we're not given that choice in an election. We're given a choice of party, not a choice of...
But that's why I said local government.
So within this context, the issue is whether or not the choice of leader might influence the way people vote toward a party. And I think that within that context, the sort of top three contenders above Jacob Zuma show some interesting potential dynamics. In the case of Pravin Gordhan and Jacob Zuma, it reflects how people are reading and essentially coming down on the debates that we've seen in the last year. And so, although it's not necessarily a choice of presidential leader, it's showing kind of how do they read those events. In terms of leadership selection, it demonstrates that Cyril Ramaphosa, if he were the leader of the ANC, would represent a serious threat to the Democratic Alliance in any future election. And so the question is, if somebody else other than Cyril Ramaphosa were leader of the party, the question is, how would the actual party dynamics play out in an election? It might mean that the alternative leader is seen more closely to Jacob Zuma if that's the choice. In other words, if it's somebody who's essentially following on from Jacob Zuma rather than somebody who's regenerating the party, we might see Mmusi Maimane pushed to the front, because Pravin Gordhan is very unlikely to be a presidential candidate.
Right. I'm going to skip ahead to our last slide. And this perhaps, Ivor, addresses some of what you were speaking about earlier. Here we are looking at a number of leaders. It is the overall rating of adult South Africans versus own party supporters. So it was testing what ordinary South Africans feel versus the supporters of a particular party. We begin with Jacob Zuma within the ANC. South African adults rating him at 4. Those within his party rating him at 5.4. And there we go. Cyril Ramaphosa within the ANC appears to be ahead of Jacob Zuma, according to this poll, among ratings by party supporters, and 5.2%, a similar trend among South African adults. Mmusi Maimane from the DA, bit of a discrepancy there, rating by his own party supporters extremely high, not necessarily so among ordinary South Africans. Julius Malema, again, another big discrepancy there. And Pravin Gordhan also included in that equation, but he appears to be slightly closer in terms of what South African adults feel about him versus the rating by his own party supporters. Ivor, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, again, I'm not sure how one can draw anything meaningful out of this. It's newspaper headlines and reputation stuff. It's not what people really think individual leaders might or might not be able to do.
Is it not a rough barometer of the feelings about a particular leader within his party versus within the South African population, the context?
Well, I don't know, because we're not looking at all the contenders in the ANC contest. Firstly, we're not looking at all the contenders in the DA context either. We know that Pravin Gordhan isn't likely to run at all in that case. So I don't know what we're measuring. It's apples and pears and bananas and pineapples. There's no clear trend that I think we can pull out of this. It's perception, popularity, media headline, all the vulgar stuff of popular opinion and popular perception and cocktail party conversation.
Is that not the dominant thought right now, the dominant trend in world politics at the moment, populism and the way leaders are perceived?
Well, I think, leaders can be perceived in different ways, and political contests require people to make an assessment and ultimately vote on them. And when I look at this information, I do think it is providing a picture. I think it is similar to the previous picture. And that is that if you had to compare Jacob Zuma to Mmusi Maimane, Mmusi Maimane comes out ahead. That's an important result if Cyril Ramaphosa does not take over as leader. Now, there are many other variables. We don't know the popularity of alternative ANC candidates other than Pravin Gordhan. But in this case, what it will be suggesting is that if Cyril Ramaphosa were the head of the ANC, the DA would actually struggle quite significantly. And that's to me what this is telling me. Julius Malema is not really a presidential candidate in terms of this. And Pravin Gordhan, rating by both SA adults and within the party, it's showing that the party is not going to select him as president, whereas the party is more likely to select Cyril Ramaphosa because he's at 5.9 versus 5.4. So just reading the results without necessarily accepting their reliability, looking at the relativities which look plausible based on other information and perceptions of and general discussions. This doesn't look like a totally implausible result, but there are unknowns.
But there's a greater danger here, because if we're going to take this stuff seriously, what we're actually saying is to politicians, don't touch base with your constituencies at grassroots level. Get a consultancy to do a quick snap survey and target your speech to the constituency to get the ratings up. So this is where image consultants come into politics. This is where communications consultants come into politics. And this is a great threat to democracy, because you pick up what people want, you translate it through a pseudo-scientific instrument, and you reflect it back to your voters saying this is what you really wanted. And you don't have politicians really engaging and touching base and communicating with their grassroots. And the scientization of politics is a great threat to democratic politics. It's much easier to do a quick poll. It's much harder to go out into a community, door to door, find out actually what people are thinking, what they want to hear. And what we're doing is we're commercializing politics and we're turning it into image consultants. We're turning politics into marketing. So you put fancy labels on a can of baked beans and you sell more. That's not what democratic politics is about. And I see these kinds of surveys as a great threat to our democracy.
I'm running out of time. Alex, I'm going to give you the last say before we wrap.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think that in every enterprise you do require some feedback from the environment. Whether or not the polls as they exist are reliable feedback is in question. But certainly if I'm seeing as a leader of the Democratic Alliance that I'm not yet above certain other people, I would want to find out why I'm not connecting with the electorate. Information does make you do certain things. The question is whether the information is accurate enough from this point of view. But whatever you do, something has got to provide that feedback.
Thank you so much to the both of you. But I do appreciate your time, and I've loved your varying opinions on this poll. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to us and break it down for us. Wits University's Dr. Ivor Sarakinski and Professor Alex van den Heever, also from Wits. Right, we'll take